Good evening and welcome back to the Unfiltered Political Lens. Tonight we're diving into one of the most important geopolitical stories unfolding in the world today. This is not simply a discussion about the United States and Iran. It is a discussion about diplomacy, war, regional security, energy markets, global trade, inflation, economic stability, and the future of an international system that affects billions of people around the world. For years, the relationship between the United States and Iran has been defined by a cycle that seems impossible to escape. Negotiations began with cautious optimism. Diplomats meet behind closed doors. Reports emerge suggesting progress is being made. Markets respond positively. Political leaders signal a willingness to avoid escalation. Then another crisis emerges. Tensions rise, accusations begin flying, and the negotiations either stall, collapse, or are pushed back into uncertainty. What makes this situation particularly fascinating is that neither side appears eager for a full-scale regional war. American officials understand the economic, military, and the political costs associated with another major conflict in the Middle East. Iranian leaders understand that a direct confrontation with the United States would carry enormous risks for their economy, their military, and the stability of their government. Yet, despite these realities, both nations continue finding themselves pulled back toward confrontation while simultaneously searching for diplomatic solutions. The root of the problem begins with trust, or more accurately, the absence of trust. Decades of sanctions, military standoffs, proxy conflicts, nuclear disputes, and political hostility have left both sides deeply skeptical of one another. American officials remain concerned about Iran's nuclear ambitions, missile programs, and regional influence. The Iranian officials point to sanctions, economic pressure campaigns, military deployments, and previous agreements that ultimately failed to produce the long-term outcomes they expected. Every new negotiation begins with the weight of past failures hanging over the room. The challenge becomes even greater because these negotiations do not occur in isolation. While diplomats may be discussing sanctions relief, nuclear restrictions, security guarantees, or economic cooperation, the events throughout the Middle East continue unfolding in real time. Military operations continue, regional rivalries continue, political pressures continue, security concerns continue. Every development has the potential to reshape the negotiating environment overnight. Now, this has led many observers to ask an important question. Why do negotiations repeatedly appear to gain momentum only to encounter the new obstacles? The answer may be found in the reality that diplomacy is attempting to function inside one of the most complex geopolitical environments on Earth. Multiple governments, military organizations, political factions, and regional actors all possess their own interests and strategic objectives. A breakthrough between Washington and Tehran does not automatically resolve the concerns of everyone else involved. One of the most debated aspects of the negotiations involves the impact that broader regional conflicts have on diplomatic progress. Some analysts argue that whenever negotiations begin making meaningful progress, renewed instability elsewhere in the region creates additional obstacles that makes the agreements harder to sustain. Others reject that argument and maintain that military operations by regional actors are driven by independent security concerns rather than diplomatic calculations. Regardless of which interpretation one favors, the reality remains the regional instability consistently complicates the diplomatic efforts and places the additional pressures on negotiators attempting to find common ground. Israel's role in the broader regional picture has become a significant topic of discussion as well. Israeli leaders, long maintained that primary concern is national security and threats they perceive from Iranian influences, missile capabilities, and allied organizations operating throughout the region. The supporters of Israel argue that security concerns cannot simply be suspended while diplomatic negotiations are taking place. Critics, however, argue that continued regional instability it will often create additional challenges for diplomacy. And whether one agrees with either position or not, it is clear that the events throughout the region inevitably affect the political environment in which the negotiations occur. This brings us to one of the most strategically important locations on the planet, the Strait of Hormuz. This narrow waterway serves as a critical artery for global energy markets. A substantial portion of the world's oil and natural gas export passes through this region, making it one of the most important economic choke points on Earth. Every time tensions rise between the United States and Iran, concerns immediately emerge regarding shipping security, energy supplies, insurance costs, and the stability of international markets. Now, what many people fail to appreciate is how deeply interconnected the modern economy has become. Oil prices influence transportation costs influence manufacturing expenses, manufacturing expenses influence consumer prices, and the consumer prices influence inflation. Inflation influences interest rates, and interest rates influence investment decisions. And in today's world, a geopolitical dispute occurring thousands of miles away can eventually affect the cost of groceries, airline tickets, housing materials, and consumer goods in communities across the United States and around the globe. If negotiations continue to fail and the tensions continue escalating, the consequences could extend far beyond the Middle East. Financial markets dislike uncertainty, and the uncertainty has become one of the defining characteristics of this conflict. The investors constantly reassess risk, businesses delay long-term decisions, and governments prepare contingency plans. Markets react not only on what is happening, but also on what could happen next. Now, for the United States, the immediate consequences, of course, would likely be economic rather than military. Americans could experience higher fuel costs, increased transportation expenses, and renewed inflationary pressures throughout the economy. Businesses would face higher operating costs, and supply chains could become more expensive, and the policymakers would once again be forced to navigate the difficult balance between controlling the inflation and maintaining economic growth. The effects on the global economy would also be even more significant. Many countries throughout Asia remain heavily dependent on the energy imports moving through the Persian Gulf. Europe continues balancing economic growth with energy security concerns. Global supply chains remain vulnerable to disruption involving the shipping routes and transportation networks as well. Because the world's economies are interconnected, and instability in one region can quickly ripple across continents. The global shipping would also face additional pressures, while increased insurance costs heighten security risk. Shipping delays and rerouted cargo routes would all increase the cost of international trade. These costs eventually make their way into the prices consumers pay every day. And what begins as geopolitical crises can ultimately become an economic challenge affecting families, businesses, and governments around the world. And perhaps the most concerning aspect of the situation is not any single crisis, but the cycle itself. Negotiations begin, optimism rises, and the markets stabilize. A new dispute emerges, tensions increase, negotiations stall, and markets react. Diplomats return to the table, then the process begins again. Every repetition erodes confidence and makes future agreements more difficult to achieve. The deeper questions, however, extends beyond the negotiations themselves. Why is the global economic system so vulnerable to the single region, a single waterway, or a single geopolitical dispute? The answer lies in how globalization evolved after the Second World War. The answer lies in how globalization evolved after the Second World War, following the war in the United States and its allies, which helped construct an international economic order based on global trade, maritime commerce, integrated financial markets, and relatively open energy flows. The idea was straightforward. The nations that became economically interconnected would have stronger incentives to cooperate and fewer incentives to engage in large scale conflict. And in many respects, the system succeeded. Global trade expanded dramatically. The living standards improved in many regions of the world, and economic growth accelerated. Hundreds of millions of people had made it and escaped poverty. Yet the systems also developed vulnerabilities that become increasingly visible as of today. Efficiency became the primary objective, and the companies concentrated production where costs were lowest. People and supply chains stretched across continents, and many industries adopted just in time delivery systems designed to maximize efficiency and minimize the cost. The countries often become dependent on small number of suppliers, transportation routes, and energy sources. And the result was extraordinarily efficient systems, but one that could also be surprisingly fragile. The Strait of Hormuz also illustrates this vulnerability perfectly. A narrow waterway located thousands of miles from most consumers can influence economic conditions across the globe because modern economies remain heavily dependent on the reliable energy flows. And when uncertainty affects energy markets, the consequences spread throughout entire economic systems. So, how can the world reduce these vulnerabilities, you might ask? Well, first, the solution is diversification. The nations can develop multiple energy sources, alternative transportation routes, and domestic production capabilities, and more resilient supply chains. The less dependent the world becomes on any single choke point, the more stable the system will become. Secondly, solutions involves maintaining a strategic reserve not only for oil, but also for the critical materials like medical supplies, industrial components, and emerging technologies. Building resilience may require accepting the higher costs during the normal times in exchange for greater stability during crises. And third, solution is simply the chain redundancy. Businesses and governments increasingly recognize the value of maintaining backup suppliers and alternative production locations. While the redundancy may appear less efficient on paper, it can prevent severe disruptions with unexpected events occur. Number 4, the solution is technological innovation. The advances in nuclear energy, renewable power, energy storage, artificial intelligence, automation, and transportation systems could gradually reduce the dependence on vulnerable regions and strategic choke points. Finally, there is diplomacy itself. Military power remains important, but long-term economic stability depends heavily on preventing conflicts from escalating into crises that threaten not only our trade routes, but our shipping lanes and global energy supplies. The most successful crisis management strategy is often preventing the crisis from occurring in the first place. The irony is that global systems was designed to create stability through interconnectedness, yet the interconnectedness has also created a world where instability in one strategic region can ripple across the entire planet. The challenge facing policymakers in the 21st century is not abandoning globalization, but it's about building a version of globalization that is more resilient and more diversified and less dependent on a hard handful of critical choke points. And ultimately, this story is about far more than the latest round of negotiations between Washington and Tehran. It is about whether diplomacy can overcome the decades of mistrust. It is about whether regional conflicts can be managed before they threaten global stability. And it is about whether the international economic system can adapt to an increasingly uncertain world. And perhaps most importantly, it is about whether the prosperity of billions of people should continue to depend on the stability of a few strategic regions and waterways. As negotiations continue and the world watches closely, one thing remains certain. The decisions made today will not simply influence the future of the United States and Iran. They may help determine the future of global energy markets, international trade, economic growth, geopolitical stability, and the world order itself. Thanks for tuning in to the Unfiltered Political Lens, and if you enjoyed this deep dive, please make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Do you believe diplomacy can eventually break the cycle, or are we witnessing the beginning of a larger geopolitical realignment? And as always, until next time, stay engaged and always peace.